All right, good morning, Alter Realty Group agents. This is Kevin Lauren. I'm the Director of Training and Marketing. And today we're going to be going through our second series of going through the new RPA with CAR. So we're going to have Lauren Noack join us again, and she's going to go through the financial stuff that goes along with the RPA. So before we go too far, I want to bring Bill Seitz on the line. And I'm going to bring Cameron Alley on the line as well. Good morning, Bill. How are you doing today?
I'm doing outstanding. How you doing, Kevin? Fantastic.
Ready for another informative webinar with Lauren.
Yeah, you trimmed that beard. It looks good.
Getting out of control. So
I can't get over it. It's too good.
I know. There you have it.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah. So I've got a couple of things queued up for you, Bill, but what's going on in mortgage land with Bill and with Cameron?
Yeah, I'll let Cameron do the update real quick, but I do want to welcome a couple agents to the webinar if they're on this morning. Ty and his team from Northern California, and also Janet Tanasugarn. I hope I pronounced that correctly, Janet. But if you guys are on this morning, we're glad to have you and welcome to the Wednesday training. I know I'm super excited to hear Lauren's part 2 here as we all get ready for this new world of contractual necessity here with CAR making their adjustments. So I'm just can't wait to see what we got in for today. Cameron, why don't you take it away for the update here?
You got it. Happy Wednesday, everybody. Can't believe it's Wednesday again already.
I know, right?
So yeah. So today rates went up a little bit today as compared to yesterday. The 10-year treasury, the controls rates has been very volatile with the inflation numbers and employment numbers. So the way it's kind of trending is when the employment numbers come out, rates go down. When the inflation data comes out, rates go up. So as far as locking in loans for your clients, we're making sure that we're looking at the timing and making our best educated guess as far as how to save them the most money and when to get that thing locked. And also too, there's some brand new news that came out today where the Fed said that they're planning to hike rates as soon as July. So we're going to have a nice little window of still low rates and maybe a softening market that's going to help your buyers be a little bit more competitive on their offers. So definitely a good time right now to continue racking it like we have been and take advantage of these historically low rates before they're gone. And then today we wanted to share a little bit of our turn times with you guys as far as our analytics compared to other lenders. If you got that, there you go. So UWM, I'm sure you guys are semi-familiar with them. They are basically the fastest and largest wholesale lender in the country. If you go down a little bit there, we should be able to see the average turn time. So UWM, as the fastest lender in the country, their average clear to close time is 14.5 days. Our turn time average for October, as far as clear to close, was 4 days. So that's saying a lot that we're 10 days ahead of the average basically broker in the fastest lending company in the country. So that's a huge statistic to look at. And the way that we're making that happen is, organization, the way we submit loans, and just trying to make it easy for your clients. If you go down a little bit more, Kev, you should be able to see a little bit more stats. So that is our average lock period. The shorter the lock, the more your clients save. The pricing's a little bit better. So that gives us a huge edge over a lot of places too, where it's just that classic 30-day lock. So you can see there, our average lock period is 18 days, which means we're locking most of our clients on a 15-day lock, as long as we know that we're going to be good on closing and contingencies. And our average lock to wire is 13.33 days. So that means as soon as we lock that loan, we're not signing in 13 days, we're funding in 13 days. And that's with refis and purchases combined. On refis, there's that 3-day rescission period. So even that, it's really about 10 days to 11 days on a purchase. So basically from lock to wire. So just wanted to show you that as far as our analytics. That's some really good stats. And I know that every week we have new realtors on here and we're growing and it's exciting. So we just want to make sure that you guys see what we can offer your clients. So Very good stuff there. And then also Kevin's got our weekly wins. Our account executive at United Wholesale Mortgage, every week he sends us basically a slide showing our weekly wins. So you can see there, we got a refi 1 day clear to close. And a quick story on that. This client is looking to buy another house and they didn't have funds for a down payment. So they gave me a call. We're like, hey, Cameron, we need 100,000 cash out of our mortgage so that we can buy another home. So I said, okay, no problem. I got all their documents, submitted it, and in 1 day we were clear to close. They're signing right now, and this is 7 days after I sent out the loan estimate, and they'll have their $100,000 in 3 days. So pretty incredible, pretty powerful that if you know your client maybe has another property and they need to get a larger down payment, we can literally get them clear to close in 1 day if we don't need an appraisal, which is, you know, extremely powerful. Then we got a 4 day clear to close purchase, 12 day clear to close purchase. And anytime that a purchase is over 10 days clear to close with us, it's just because of the appraisal, most likely. Just getting that in quick and fast. But, you know, it doesn't take us usually any longer than 6 days if we got an appraisal waiver. So, and you can also see all those same day approvals, which means your clients are knowing what they need to close the same day that we submit the loan. So very powerful stuff there. And then one more thing to add, as a mortgage broker, we have a lot of investors, right? I think we have like 12 to 13 investors that we're working with right now. So quick little story. We had one of the ALTR realtors who was looking to close a purchase for their clients. And we went through the whole process, got the appraisal done, and there was a COVID overlay, which kind of affected the DTI. So we ended up getting denied with that lender. Took that loan, submitted it to another lender, and got it clear to close in 4 days. And now the client's going to sign, and they got their home. So, you know, there's a lot of benefits to working with a mortgage broker. One is speed, one is price, and one is flexibility and ability to, you know, have several different underwriters see the approval on that loan in case it doesn't work out on the first one. So, you know, very good story there. And, you know, our number one priority is making sure that your clients get closed and they're able to get in their home no matter what avenue we need to take. But that's pretty much all I have today. I think Bill's got a couple things he wants to chat about real quick. But thanks for your time as always, guys.
Yeah, Cameron, that is the key word there is powerful. Cameron is just an absolutely outstanding professional in this business. He truly knows how to take care of his clientele. And so I encourage you guys, if you guys don't have a go-to, please reach out to Cameron. He's always there for you. And, you know, we're just trying to build the strongest team possible. So that was an excellent overview, Cameron. Appreciate that. Lastly, I just wanted to touch base. We're working on some co-branding flyers with United Wholesale. United Wholesale has some really good marketing templates. So if you guys are doing open houses, you guys are having showings, you need material for your borrowers or your clients that just want to, you know, look at some financing options, or you want to have something of value to give to your clients, it could be co-branded with yourselves and us at Clearview. We're going to be rolling out some examples of that next week before Lauren goes into part 3 of the contract. So I hope everybody will be excited about that, because we are, and I think it's going to be a great, you know, partnership that we can start building, doing that kind of stuff.
Oh, that's huge, Bill. And we're also going to be rolling out another program through Canva as well. So cool stuff to show you guys next week. And yes, we'll hopefully have Lauren come back for part 3. If not, we'll definitely be finishing the series this year, of course. So Lauren, come on onto the line if you can unmute yourself.
Hello there.
Good morning. How are you today?
I'm good. How are you?
We're doing fantastic. So part 2 is going to be all about the financials, right?
Yep.
Okay.
We're going to go definitely more into detail on the money stuff.
Okay, perfect. Well, you are able to share your screen now. So hop on there, and remember, we do have a chat feature, and we do have question and answers. Oh, I've already got a question from Albert. Albert's always good for some questions, which we love. Does UWM do manufactured home loans?
Yes, they do. And they actually just made it so that we can even do them on condo land, which basically means if it's in a community, we can also finance those now, and it's still a conventional loan.
Cool.
So the answer is yes, we do manufactured homes.
There you go. There you go, Albert. All right, perfect. Well, you guys can now see Lauren's screen. So again, don't hesitate to put questions in the chat, and we will do our best to answer all of them.
All righty. Perfect. So let me just get all set up here. So thank you so much for having me back. The last time I was on here, we did sort of a general overview of this new contract coming out. We looked at the first few pages and the last few pages. And so today we're going to look a little bit closer at the terms throughout the contract, and more specifically, ones having to do with money. And it's not your money, it's your client's money. So it's even more important that you learn how to navigate this section correctly.
For sure. And real quick, if you guys didn't get last week's webinar, of course, it is available on our YouTube channel. And I do send those replays out. So if you're not getting the replays, just contact me and make sure that we are getting those out to you. Okay.
Yes, please check that out. There's a ton of information. This one hopefully will not be as long as the last one, cramming a lot into a little amount of time, but we've got some good bits here today as well. So a little bit about me. I've been in real estate since 2009. I am the owner operator of the TC Advantage, an independent transaction coordinator company. And over that time, since I started the company, we've closed over 2,500 transactions. This year to date, we've closed over 470. We're on track to close about 600 this year. So we see a ton of transactions. We see all the different ways people fill out contracts. We see all the different ways clients behave and lenders behave, and escrow and title and other agents, other brokerages. So we have a ton of experience that we like to then turn around and create as a benefit for our agents. I have my real estate license. I don't actively sell real estate. I use that license to give me access to this sort of education and training. And because of that license, I am also CAR certified as a transaction coordinator and as a forms trainer. So we're going to be bouncing around the contract
so we're
a
in
lot.
good hands.
Yeah. Yes. So I'm not just like making this up. This is
Right.
my wheelhouse. I love this stuff. So I have a lot of experience with it. So today we're going to be, like I said, bouncing around the contract a lot. So if possible, it's a good idea to have a copy of this new contract available so that you can reference it, either a digital copy or even print it out so you can make notes on it. In order to access a copy of the new contract, you're going to log into CAR.org. Up at the top where it says Transaction Center, click on that, then click on Standard Forms. Once you click on that link, there's like a little hyperlink that says Form Revisions and New Form Releases. And then from there, you'll see a link to the 2021 RPA draft. Also, when you click on the link for the draft, that'll give you a digital copy. You can print it out. This is going to be the most up-to-date version. It's tentatively scheduled to be released the second week of December, but it's sort of a moving target. So you'll know it when you see it. It will, the other version, the current version, will not be available in zip forms or in Glide. So you'll know when it lands. Also on that same page where you can download a copy or view a copy of this draft, there is also a link to sign up for some of the courses through CAR on this new contract. I really, really recommend that you take a class from CAR on this new contract. December seems like it's far away, but it's not. And the 4-hour course counts towards your continuing education credits. So it's kind of a win-win there. So today we're going to be talking about all things financial. We're going to go over scenarios for all cash purchases, conventional loans, FHA, VA loans, appraisals, your deposits or increased deposits, anything having to do with credits, any hidden costs that are in the contract that you might not think of or be aware of. And then we'll go over what the additional courses or webinars will be in the series, that things that we didn't hit on last time or this time that we're going to try and make a point to include. So to jump in and get started, we're going to talk about your all cash purchases. The last time when we did the overview of the contract, we went over the grid in detail, and we covered the best way to navigate the layout. But as a refresher, the grid takes up the first 3 pages of the contract. It includes all negotiable fields. If there's a term to be modified in the contract, you're going to find it in the grid. Now, the all cash box used to be buried in the financing terms of the current contract, but now it's right up front, and you notice it's the second term right after the purchase price. So there's no missing or wondering or looking to find if it's an all cash purchase or not. The second column of the grid references a paragraph in the contract that's going to provide us with more information and details about an all cash purchase. And this paragraph just clarifies that, again, the agreement is not contingent on the buyer obtaining a loan. So what does that mean? It means you don't need to then check the box in the contract saying there's no loan contingency. It's already in the contract. Checking the box is just redundant. It also says that the buyer has to deliver to the seller a written verification of funds sufficient for the purchase price and the closing costs. So a lot of times listing agents don't always factor in that element of the additional closing costs. You want to make sure as the listing agent with your seller, you're carefully reviewing this documentation provided by the buyer when they're giving you these proof of funds. If you receive proof of funds for just the purchase price or maybe the balance after the initial deposit, ask for new verification. If there's a price increase through counter offers, you want to make sure that you have documentation from the buyer that they have enough funds to meet the purchase price and any additional closing costs. It also says in this paragraph, within the time specified in 3H1, if you remember any item referenced for paragraph 3, that's going to be in the grid. The entire grid is paragraph 3, and then it's broken down into those additional letters. So we know here paragraph 3H1 is referencing that section in the grid. It's important to note that the new contract has all verifications attached to the offer as the default term. So the current contract is the other way around. The current contract, the default is we'll get it to you within 3 days of acceptance, which is ridiculous, because why would a seller accept an offer and then have to wait 3 days to find out if the buyer has the funds or the verification of loan or any of that stuff? So now it's the other way around. So don't be in the habit of checking this box, and make sure that you're aware of that. Oh no, my image disappeared.
Oh well.
Okay, well, okay.
Oh, I can see
So
the little
there-
image marker, right?
I know. Hold on. I'm going to fix this because this is going to bother me.
Take your time, Lauren. Of course, any questions
Sorry.
come up, that's okay. We all understand the joys of live webinars.
Technology. Okay. Let's see. So this has to do. Okay. Just Canva on the fly here.
All right. Like I said, next week we're going to be showing you guys some really cool Canva stuff, and we'll have a special offer for you as well. So really cool. Courtney in the marketing department has been spending hourless hourless nights or many hours per night going through tons of different templates and all kinds of really cool stuff. High-end looking flyers. So I think it'll be really cool.
Okay. It's not working. So I'm just going to wing it. This is the paragraph 6C. And you can see up there on the top the reference, but basically it's the paragraph in the contract that is buyer stated financing. Let me just share my screen here real quick.
Perfect.
Okay. Oh, I hope it doesn't do this to me again. Okay, so paragraph 6C in the contract essentially says, I just had like a little screen grab of it, but the buyer, should the buyer decide to pursue alternate financing, the seller doesn't have to cooperate, but they cannot interfere with the closing. Okay, so this paragraph isn't directly referenced in the grid in that second column, but it's still really important to know. So it's really common in all cash deals, but we've also seen situations where buyers will switch from conventional financing to FHA, or sometimes the other way around. So this applies to any element of buyer stated financing. And so basically it says that the buyers can pursue the alternate financing. So if they make this offer as all cash, but they still want to maybe try and get a loan, they're still required to abide by the timeframes and the closing date in the contract. And the seller has no obligation to cooperate with the buyer's efforts. So in that same realm, the seller can't just refuse to close escrow because the buyer went from all cash and now they're getting a loan. If the buyer can still close on time and meet all of the timeframes in the contract, but now just with a loan, then the buyer can do that and they can move forward. The seller doesn't have to open the property for an appraisal. The seller doesn't have to, make any lender requested repairs, things like that. But it's sort of this protection in there for the seller. A lot of the wording in this paragraph is the exact same as what it is currently in the contract. The only exception is the last sentence of this paragraph, and that says that the buyer's inability to obtain alternate financing does not excuse the buyer from the obligation to purchase the property and close escrow as specified in this agreement. So again, if the buyer tries, makes an offer all cash, tries to get a loan, can't get a loan, the buyer can't cancel based on not being able to get a loan. They're still obligated to close escrow all cash. And
Cool.
So
Quick
this
question.
is now written in. Yeah, go ahead.
That's awesome. Quick question from Cheryl Peterson. Good morning, Cheryl. So buyer can switch all cash and try for a loan. Yes, but they have to close within the specified period.
Correct. Yes. So if you have a 15-day all cash and then the buyer is like, well, I'd really rather not use all my cash. I want to get a loan. And okay, well, day 10, well, we're going to need an extension. No, you can still, if the buyers removed their investigation contingency, because remember, there's no loan contingency once that all cash box has been checked. So they don't have that loan contingency.
Right.
The seller can issue a demand to close and, potentially cancel.
Yeah. So in that case, that buyer's going to need Clearview Mortgage if they're going to
absolutely. With those kind of turnaround times, yes.
Only way to get it done quick.
Exactly.
Nice plug, Kev.
There we go. Shameful self-promotion. There we are.
Oh my goodness. Very true though. Very true. So are there any other questions about kind of the all cash approach? It's really kind of short and sweet for that section. Okay, cool. So I'm going to move on to the conventional loan. This section's extremely important because in any contract where a loan is involved, because these are arguably material terms, and without them, it can then be argued that you don't have a valid contract. So this section needs to be filled out completely and correctly. The first thing to note in this section on the grid here is that conventional loan is the default term. So even on the current contract, it is the default term. And I still see a bunch of agents check a box, write in other and say conventional. It's already in there. That's the default. So know that going forward. The other things to note in this section, this might take some getting used to. I think if they had added lines across, it would have been too much visually, but also not having any lines kind of makes it a little confusing. We're used to reading left to right, but also up and down. So you want to read like first interest rate points, you know, instead of first and then going across to the right. So I've highlighted those sections as they're broken down. So you kind of get a better idea of how to read it and visualize it. And so the first section, this is where you're going to fill out your loan amount. So it's my understanding that if you enter in a dollar amount, the percentage will auto-populate and vice versa. That's the plan. We'll see if that's how it operates in zip forms. But we won't know until it comes out. And so the next section, this part has two elements, right? So the first is the rate type. The default rate is a fixed rate. If the buyer is going to be getting an initial adjustable rate loan, then you check that box. And then the second section is the not to exceed field for the percentage rate amount. I know it kind of looks like the rest of that line only applies when you check the box, but you still have to fill in that whole field. It makes it look like, oh, the interest rate is a fixed rate or an adjustable rate not to exceed blank. But that's not the case. It's a fixed rate not to exceed blank or an adjustable rate not to exceed blank. Does that make sense? So you want to make sure that you include this percentage point.
That is a little
For
weird.
buyers.
That does.
Yeah. Yeah. So for buyers, these are terms that determine your right to cancel based on your loan contingency. If you leave this section blank and then the lender comes back and says, sure, we can do this loan, but it's going to be a 10% interest rate, you can't cancel based on the loan contingency because there's no cap. You didn't have an exceed point. So the seller could, in theory, say, no, you still have to go through with it. So by putting this specific interest rate amount of not to exceed, that protects the buyer for what their max amount is. Also, sellers, listing agents, when the buyer fills this part out with a specific amount, it shows they're serious. It shows they've been, pre-qualified, pre-approved, that they're ready to go, that they know what they're looking for, they know what they're comfortable with and capable of doing for their loan. Another thing,
Lauren,
agents. Oh yeah, go ahead.
I would say that this is probably the most, the least properly filled out area is one of the, I'm sure it's a pet peeve for you and your and your staff, but
yeah,
I can't emphasize how important this is. This is a key point, especially for, like you said, protecting your buyers and also, giving them obviously an out if the market turns. Like, rates are volatile. Things do change. They change daily. Sometimes they change multiple times a day. And if it's a tight qualifying scenario and they only can fit in at, let's say 3.5%, let's say the market turns against you, it's not locked in. Now the rates are 3.875 or closer to 4%. They can't qualify. If you don't fill this out properly, you might not be able to protect your buyers. Yeah,
exactly. So it's so important, and I 100% agree. This is the most common, probably the only one that comes in second to this is agents not signing their own contracts. But other than that, this is like the number one thing that doesn't get filled out correctly. So the other thing to note on that as well, which I'm glad they don't kind of have any sort of blank section for here, but in terms of counteroffers, listing agents, please stop countering back at current market rate or best market rate. Because current market rate, when you wrote the counteroffer, when the buyer needs to sign their loan documents, when it's ambiguous. And when you create ambiguity, that's where the issues are. So be specific. If you want to counter back, if this isn't filled out and you want to counter back as the listing agent to lock in this buyer and commit them, pick a number, say 10%, whatever, the buyer can then counter that back to something realistic, but be specific. It doesn't help to have those sort of general terms. And then the other section here is the points. And it's not really laid out or clarified like this in the current contract. So a lot of agents may not really be familiar with this element. The points, if I understand all correctly, this lets you make a trade-off between your upfront costs and the monthly payment. So when you pay points, you're paying more upfront, but you receive a lower interest rate. And so you pay less over time. So paying points can be a good choice for somebody who knows they're going to keep this loan for a long time. The important thing to note as a listing agent or when you're reviewing these offers, points are paid at closing, and these increase the buyer's closing costs. So that needs to be a factor when you're looking at their loan amounts, their verification of funds, their, all of that stuff. The default in the contract is that the buyer is paying 0 points. So the terms in the first 2 sections above, those are going to remain unchanged for the most part. So it's already capped at or default at 0 points. So you really would only fill that out if that's going to be anything other than 0. I hope I explained that correctly. Okay.
You did a good job, Lauren. Yeah. Yeah. And generally, 1 point is 1%. So,
right.
2 points would be 2%. Quarter point is obviously a 1/4%. So,
and isn't it on the loan amount?
Correct.
Right? Or the
Yes.
purchase price? It's a loan amount. Okay. Right.
Yeah.
Okay. Whew, math, not my wheelhouse. Okay.
Well,
so,
and just lastly to that point, that's why it's really important. I'm just going to plug like Cameron again, just because if you are working really symbiotically with someone like Cameron who knows his craft backwards and forwards and sideways, and he can give you this detailed information, I feel like a lot of agents don't truly understand financing through and through, and that's okay. But you got to have a go-to. You got to have somebody that can be in your pocket, that can be your asset in these situations, because that's only going to make you a stronger agent and do a better job with your clients.
Perfect. Love it. Okay. So in that same sense, now as a listing agent, you're reviewing this with your seller, you've seen the terms the buyer is proposing. Now you need to be able to verify what the buyer is proposing. And so to do that, again, you would review a verification of loan application, and that comes in a couple of different forms. But it's important, like I mentioned before, the default in the contract is that it's attached to the offer. So no more like, oh, we'll get you an updated one in 3 days with the property address or whatever. Like, no, it's attached to the offer. That's the expectation. So the type of verification can come, you have the option to select one of 3 types in the additional terms section on the far right. So you can do pre-qualification, right? So this is like your level 1. This is the buyer gives the lender basic information. Lender gives them general idea of what they're going to qualify for. It's all self-reported by the buyer. The next level would be sort of pre-approval. It's where your lender is going to go a step further, verify the buyer's financials, run the credit, that sort of a thing. The other option is a fully underwritten pre-approval, which is probably the most thorough review and verification of the buyer's lending potential. So last time too, I think, Bill, you asked about DU approval, which is another common type of verification. From what I understand, that falls kind of somewhere between pre-approval and full underwriting approval.
Yeah, that's just that's a basically a
software
system that a lot of the banks will use. It's tied to Freddie and Fannie, that they basically can, review the file quickly through their software system and give you even a further than just the pre-approval, right? Just goes another step. It says approve eligible, or it's declined for whatever reason. But that's a pretty darn good reading on whether or not you're getting the loan.
Right, exactly. Yeah. And so the the fully underwritten pre-approval is, again, a majority of that underwriting process is done. Things are verified. You could even, probably remove that loan contingency element and compete as an all cash offer when you have a fully underwritten pre-approval. So that DU approval is sort of in the middle. It's sort of, from what I understand, like a snapshot of financial debt, assets, all of those are kind of included on that approval form. But in any case, if you have, if your buyer or if your seller receives an offer that has DU approval, you just wouldn't check any of these boxes because they don't apply. The column with the boxes is just additional terms. So it's not necessarily a requirement to check off those specifically. This just gives you that option to include one of these three. And then, of course, if you have any questions about clarification and what type, definitely reach out to Cameron. Okay, so this section of the grid, you can see in that second column, also references paragraph 6B in the contract. 6B, I'm glad this one worked. Okay, it basically says that the verification letter should reflect the terms in the grid and should be provided by the time frame noted in the grid, which we've already said is the default is that it's included in the contract. So it's important to note how specific the contract is in the type of verification. It says right in here, a letter from the buyer's lender or a loan broker stating that based on a review of the buyer's written application and credit report. It goes on to say if any loan specified in paragraph 3E is an adjustable rate loan, the pre-qualification or pre-approval letter should be based on that qualifying rate, not on the initial loan rate. So for a lot of agents that might be new, this contract really breaks down, really for the buyer and seller, but kind of a benefit to newer agents, what you should be looking for and what is expected when it says, here's your verification. I think it's such a casual element in transactions. When people receive offers, it's just sort of like, oh yeah, there's this document, it has a lender logo on it, and oh, there's the dollar amount, that's the purchase price or the offer amount. That's like all that they look at. And it's really important that you know what you're looking for and what you're looking at when you have this, get this verification. And it's perfectly within a seller's rights to go back to the buyer and say, I need more information. Okay. So let's see. Oh, it looks like I did it again. Grr. Okay, so paragraph 5C3. I'm just going to pull up a copy of the contract here.
Totally. That works as well.
Yeah, I'm just going to jump to that here.
And I just put Cameron's information into the chat if anybody needs it. And I'm putting Lauren's info in as we speak.
Yeah, thank you, Kevin, for doing that. I was thinking that we should have let everyone know where they can find Cameron for any financing needs. Obviously, he also has a website. I believe it's CameronAlley.com.
That's correct. So
he spelled his last name A-L-L-E-Y. So it's Cameron, CameronAlley.com is his personalized website. And then you can find him on our Clearview website as well, with the rest of our loan officers and their contact information.
And I always put his information as well as Lauren's information in the replay.
Okay, thanks guys. Let's see if I can get it together here.
Just filled a little airspace for you, Lauren.
I appreciate that. Okay, so I pulled up the contract and let me see if I can jump.
Oh, you know what? Also, quick question from Albert. He says,
yeah,
or he asks, is it true there's 91 forms changing?
There are 63 ancillary forms that are getting updated. Some of them are like dumb updates. There's like changing the lead-based paint form. It's the exact same form, but instead of the code being FLD, it's LPD, and like that counts as changing. So some of those documents that are being changed aren't major, but we're going to touch base throughout the series on some of those other specific forms and those changes. Contingency removals, anything basically, because the contract, all of the reference sections are shuffled around. Anything on another form that references part of the purchase agreement is going to have to get changed or updated. So contingency removal form, repair request form, you know, things like that, where it's like you have to reference to terms in the contract, you're going to see some layout changes. And most of them are getting longer. So boo. Okay.
Of course they are.
I know. It's more, I mean, for me, that's job security. Give us more paperwork. I'm fine.
Totally.
But yeah. So, okay. So we got it together. I figured out what my issue was. So, okay. So this is paragraph 5C3. This is another section that isn't directly referenced on the grid, but it's really powerful. This paragraph here was added. It provides authorization to communicate with the buyer's lender, and it's written right into the contract now. So this is for the loan the buyer has proposed in the contract, the loan a buyer might be pursuing it as alternative financing. If they wrote an all cash offer and now they're switching to a loan, the seller and their agent can reach out and communicate with that lender. A loan, if the buyer still has their loan contingency in place, or if they've removed their loan contingency, any time the seller or the seller's authorized agent wants to check the status of a buyer's loan, of any buyer's loan, they now have written authorization right into the contract in this 5C3 section. Keep in mind, it's only to determine the status of the loan. So you're not going to get, it's not authorization for any financial information on the buyer of like, what's their debt to income ratio or what, you know, any of that stuff. It's just status of the loan. This section also requires the buyer to provide the contact information for their lender if the information ends up being different from what was provided in their verification letter. So if they gave a pre-approval letter for one lender and all of a sudden escrow is going back and forth with the new lender, the buyer has 1 day to get that information of their new lender to the seller or the seller's authorized agent. And you'll see that the time frame right there for 1 day upon seller's request, that's not in the grid. So it's not negotiable. You can't alter that time frame. Buyer has 1 day, that's it. If the buyer fails to deliver this information to the seller can then issue a notice to perform and subsequently cancel.
Hey, Lauren, on this topic, Cameron gave an example that he submitted in the start of this webinar. He submitted an offer that was declined, or basically there was a COVID overlay, right? So the file was declined, right? And he had to switch investors. Now the way this reads, obviously, where you have 1 day to alert the other parties that there's been a change. Other than the alert, is there anything that needs to be written?
As in,
so if I call you and you're the other agent, I said, hey, Lauren, my buyer, looks like we're gonna have to shift gears. Looks like we can get it done with another investor. Letting you know, Does anything have to be put in writing, or is it just? I mean, if it's not, I would say put it in an email and make sure you've got this time stamped, so it can be verified that you did make that effort and you do, But I was just wondering if they had talked about delivering any of that information. Is there anything that has to go on a form or has to be put out there?
There's no specific form associated with it, and you'll see where it says buyer shall deliver. That last line right there, deliver is capital D, and so that means that the term delivered, delivery, or delivered, those are specific terms defined in the purchase agreement. So you'll see here.
So what I would do then, if this happens to you guys as agents out there in these situations, I would definitely put it in writing in the email. So that is your delivery method. If you say you did it verbally, somebody could just say, you know what, they never called me. They never, you know what I mean? They never. So that would be an area where it could be a problem.
Yes. So it's the personal receipt, a copy of a document applicable, a link to the document. Let's see here. Whoa. So delivery does include electronic delivery. The best practice is if you can get a pre-approval letter. So sometimes, like, I think of a scenario of like, oh, if they're maybe double apping or something like that, or like, you know, if you can get a new pre-approval letter or an email from the new lender or something saying, you know, like with their contact information, that would be ideal. But an email saying, hey, we changed lenders, here's their contact info, totally acceptable. So there's no specific form associated with that delivery of information. It can be electronic, and it can just be, again, too, like within 1 day of the seller's request. So the seller has to ask for it first. But
at the same time, if you don't deliver that information to them, right, you're kind of changing the contractual terms without the other party knowing, which is kind of a unilateral thing when the seller can say, hey, you didn't tell me this, you know what I mean? So potentially there's an issue there, but
because the buyer is saying, the buyer has said, I am going to purchase your property as long as I can get this loan for these terms through this lender on this I've been pre-qualified with this lender to get this loan on these terms. And the seller said, okay, I agree to that. And now the buyer's changing it up behind the seller's back, right? And so maybe this new lender is changing those terms. You know, maybe the seller is like, no, I think this is going to be way too risky. This is going to cause delays. Whatever the seller's reasoning is, it needs to be mutually agreed upon. So the buyer does need to notify the seller. Okay, so are there any questions about filling out the contract for conventional loans? That's kind of most of that chunk there. Fairly straightforward.
Looks like we're clear.
Okay, good. So now we're going to jump on to loans for FHA or VA offers. So now when you're writing an offer with a VA or FHA loan, you're going to complete this section the same way as the conventional loan, in the sense that the loan amount, interest rate, the point fields, those all need to be completed the same way. But now there's also 2 additional sections that you want to make sure you review. So since the default loan type in the contract is conventional, you need to check one of these boxes for either FHA or VA, and you see that in the far right column. And then when either of those boxes are checked, the CAR forms FVAC and HID should be automatically added to the transaction, but they're also considered to be incorporated into the contract. So to go a little bit more in depth of the FVAC form, this requires you to fill out your minimum value for the appraisal, what the appraisal should come in at. When you have this form, even if the appraisal contingency is removed with the offer, the buyer can still cancel based on an appraisal that comes in lower than the amount on this form. If the purchase price increases, so if there's a counteroffer situation or the buyer increases their offer, you need to sign a new FVAC form with the new adjusted price. Only if it increases. If it goes down, obviously you don't need to, but only if you have a price change, price increase.
Can you repeat that again, Lauren, real quick? You said if there's no loan, if there's no appraisal contingency, they can still cancel if it comes in below this where this marker is?
Correct. Yes.
Interesting.
And so the I think I can jump ahead here real quick.
Albert says, so be upfront with the seller. Very much so.
right? Oh
Yeah.
yeah. I mean, and we'll touch on this a little bit more too, of like what these loan types mean or imply. I think they kind of have like a bad rap. They're not that bad. You just need to know what you're getting into. So here you'll see this section. This is actually for the appraisal contingency, but you'll see on the far right in that column under the no appraisal contingency box, it says right here, removal of appraisal contingency does not eliminate appraisal cancellation rights in the FVAC form. So it notifies everybody up front, you can remove this appraisal contingency, but if you have an FHA loan, you're still, the terms on that FVAC form still apply. Okay. So now the FHA BA appraisal requirements, those are typically more involved, and they require sometimes corrections or repairs for things to be made, to things like chipping paint, loose or exposed wiring, things like that, that a regular appraisal might call out, but like it won't be required to be repaired. And so when there are lender required repairs to be made, the buyer can then make the request to the seller on the repair request form or the AEA form, which is that amendment of existing agreement. It's like an addendum that everybody forgets about this form, but anyway, it's like an addendum. But they have to do so within the time specified on the grid. Okay, so currently there's a form called the FVA that's just for lender, FHA, VA lender requested repairs. Most agents don't even know it exists, and if they do, they never use it anyway. So they're discontinuing that form, and now they've revised the repair request form to allow for this specific type of request. So this is one of those forms, that kind of those ancillary forms, that is being updated and revised. So there's a section now, these excerpts are from the repair request form. The repair request form is now going back to being 2 pages again, yay. But it's because they've expanded the form to include a lot more options. So one of the options is adding this section here for FHA or VA lender required repairs. And you have 2 options. The buyer can ask the seller to make specific repairs called out by the lender. The buyer can also request the seller pay for costs or expenses required by the FHA or VA lender. I don't know firsthand what examples of that specific case might be, but just know you have those 2 options.
Real quick, Lauren,
yeah.
An example for VA would be termite.
Okay, so the seller paying the cost of termite.
Yeah, because that's a requirement.
Or would that be
for a VA loan?
Right, but then would that go? That would go in section A though, right? As pay for such repairs, the termite repairs, or maybe.
Well, I'm just saying. Let's just say the seller and the listing agent didn't do that up front, and they get a offer that doesn't specify it, but it's a VA loan. Well,
yep,
it's gonna have to be done.
Right, exactly. So yeah, you can do that one of 2 ways. I think maybe in section A you can say the repairs for the termite report or section 1 clearance or what have you, or in section B you can just say the cost to provide termite clearance. You can either be like really specific in section A for what those terms are, and maybe a little bit more general in B. I don't know. It'll be interesting to see how this kind of gets utilized, if at all. I think a lot of agents forget that these sort of requests can be separate. You know, the contract is an as-is contract, and so the seller doesn't have to respond to any of these repairs or these requests, but it's still sometimes, so you know, you can say like, oh, the seller's not going to make any repairs, but then you still might have to submit a repair request form because the lender is asking for specific repairs. So if that's the case, this is where it would go in the repair request in this section.
Lauren, I always laugh at when I see a contract or a counter, it says property is sold as is. Like
Ugh.
no SHIT. It's like, but that doesn't mean anything. If you uncover something in the inspection or anything that comes as a material factor, anything that's going to change the buyer, they can still ask for it. It doesn't matter. You know what I mean?
Exactly. It is like one of the biggest recommendations from CAR Legal for agents to not write that into the contract, because the contract has been so carefully constructed and litigated to the point where it already says as is. And I know a lot of agents are like, well, my seller just wants to reiterate that fact. And like, you need to let your seller know, if we write this term into the contract, then that can create ambiguity, because when you say as is, does that mean, what about government required retrofit? What about, things like this, where if they're like lender requirements, the contract already has the as is clause, but it accounts for those certain elements. And then when you go in and you rewrite that, then you create ambiguity and there can be confusion, and that could end up being an issue. If your seller really wants to see that wording, copy and paste it from the contract. Just to clarify, section blah, 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 whatever it's going to be in this new contract, remains true or something like that, but it is already written in there, and it's really not a good idea to rewrite that. Okay, so so right above the seller's response section of this repair request form, there's a notice to the seller telling them for FHA or VA loans, if the seller doesn't agree to the lender repair requests, then the buyer won't be able to get the loan. And if the loan contingency is still in place, then the buyer can cancel. It's just giving the seller a heads up. And then if the buyer accepts the seller's response, maybe the seller said no to these repairs, or maybe they said, okay, I'll do some. There's a notification to the buyer. If the buyer accepts the seller's response, then this notice warns them that the seller didn't agree to all of these lender repairs requested, and then the buyer removes their loan contingency anyway. This might make them ineligible for this loan. And if now they can't get the loan, but they've removed their loan contingency, they could be in breach of contract, and they might be responsible for the purchase price to the seller. So it's really important to understand how all of these elements are sort of tied together. Things like repair requests, how that's tied to these loan requirements. These notifications are the same on the repair request response form as well, the RRRR. The other change on the repair request form also allows now for the seller to agree to some of the buyer requests. I think currently they accept it, they respond on the RRR form, or they decline them. So now there's two additional options where the seller can say, okay, I agree to some of these things, or you can check a box that says this repair request isn't part of the contract. The seller's going to respond on the AEA form, which is that amendment of existing agreement form, which again is like an addendum. So there's a couple of options that have been expanded on this repair request form.
And Michael asks, what about credit?
We're going to get to that.
Okay.
There, on the repair request form, there's that option for the seller to offer a credit in lieu of. Sorry about that. So, okay. Now the time frame for submitting these lender requests is all the way back in that loan section, because they had nowhere else to put it. I don't know. It has nothing to do with the loan, but this is a time frame that is thrown into that same section. So I guess it's kind of important to know as the seller or the listing agent, hey, this offer, this loan is FHA or VA, and the buyer has 17 days by default to get us a list from their lender of any repairs that might be required. So obviously you can adjust that number, but again, the default is 17. So either way, if any requests are received after this time frame, the seller might not necessarily have to acknowledge the request, or it could be deemed reasonable to not even address them. But it's a section that doesn't really have any teeth for the seller, because then the buyer doesn't get the loan and they can cancel. So it just, I don't know, it's a weird section, but there's nothing saying that the buyer can't be responsible for those costs too, which is something to consider. So maybe the seller won't do it. Then will the buyer say, okay, I'll cover these costs so I can get the loan and complete this transaction? Maybe that's an option. I don't know. Are there any questions on the FHA VA section? I haven't butchered this too bad. Like I said, there's a lot of jumping around, so people are going to get kind of whiplash from all of this.
That's okay. We can always go back and review. Okay.
Exactly. Exactly.
That's what the replays are for, right?
For sure. Okay. So I'm going to jump ahead then to appraisals. So the FHA VA requirements kind of segue into this next element, which is the appraisal. Now, remember, the appraisal and the loan contingencies are separate. It used to be back in the day, when you remove the loan contingency, then the appraisal contingency was automatically removed, but that hasn't been the case for a while. So these are two separate types of contingencies. And the sections in the contract that reference elements about the appraisal are going to be this 3L2, which anything that's section 3, this is on the grid. And then on page 5 in section 8B. So we're going to kind of jump into those. I'm not going to go over the appraisal elements related to the specific appraisal contingency. We're going to cover that on a different webinar about contingencies and timeframes and deadlines. But you can see here that the default is for the appraised value to be at a minimum of the purchase price. Or there's an option to fill in that line with another dollar amount. I always say there's nothing more dangerous than an agent with a line to fill out on their own. I don't know what it is, but you guys always end up trying to dust off your legal degree and write up terms that I don't even know where they come from. So they just end up causing ambiguity and chaos. And I don't know where you guys get these words sometimes. So having said that, it's still become increasingly common, especially in this market, for buyers to offer more than what the property is going to appraise for. And then they do that and they're like, well, it might appraise for less, but I'm willing to pay a certain amount over the appraisal price, right? So the default in the contract is the appraisal needs to come in at this certain amount. You can also add in another section, CAR, or another amount or value. CAR has a one-page quick guide, which is really helpful. You can find it at the link there. And it's called Amending the Appraisal Contingency the Wrong Way and the Right Way. And this is just kind of a little excerpt of how to make that amendment, or to include that terminology in the offer that the buyer is willing to pay a little bit higher than the appraisal price. And you can see from the example that is right that you want to mimic the language and the sections in the contract as much as possible. So I highly recommend looking through all of those quick guides from CAR. Are awesome. They also have one for escalation clauses, which is like buyer will pay $10,000 more than the highest priced offer. And that, again, blank fields, chaos. So there's a whole guide, one page, really quick and succinct, to tell you how to do that properly as well. So I highly recommend that you check that out. And then obviously this would be a case where you would see that TOA, or the text overflow addendum, that would appear on this line, and then you would get that separate addendum because you can't fit a whole bunch of different terms and things like that on this one line. So keep that in mind. And then again, just pointing out that the appraisal, removal of that appraisal contingency with the offer still keeps those cancellation rights in the FVAC form when it's an FHA or a VA loan. Whoops. Okay. When it comes to the delivery of the appraisal report, This last sentence in paragraph 12D clarifies that typically the buyer doesn't have to provide the appraisal report to the seller. So this section isn't referenced in the grid directly, but it's important to know. In general, this section just talks about like that the buyer has to give the seller copies of all reports done on the property within a certain time frame. So there's 3 days within receipt of these reports. And you'll notice that you can adjust that time because it references paragraph 3L. So the time to turn those reports over can be adjusted. That'll be on the grid. But the last sentence in this paragraph lets you know if the loan is FHA or VA, the buyer is then required to provide the seller with a copy. And so typically the buyer does not need to give the appraisal report to the seller unless it's an FHA or a VA loan. If the buyer cancels the contract based on the appraisal, then they could also be required to provide the seller a copy, but only upon the seller's request. Typically, the seller or the listing agent don't ask for a copy because then it becomes a material fact, and then the seller is required to provide that to buyers that follow. So, but sometimes they're like, prove it, you know, and so then they get a copy of the appraisal report, and the buyer has to turn it over if the seller requests when they're canceling based on the appraisal. Okay, so that was it for the appraisal section. So we've touched base on the different loan types. And so now we're going to talk about the deposit. And so this section, again, there's a part in the grid, D1 and 2, that talks about the deposit and the increased deposit. And then on page 4 in paragraph A, this is going to go into more detail about the deposit and the increased deposit terms. And so it's important to remember on counteroffers, the second item of counteroffers, buyer counter, seller multiple, regular seller counteroffer, specifically says, unless otherwise agreed to in writing, the down payment and the loan amount will be adjusted in the same proportion as in the original offer, but the initial and increased deposit amount shall remain unchanged from the initial offer, original offer. So if you'll remember on the grid where we're talking about the different loan amounts, there is that section that is the percentage of the purchase price, right? So if you're changing the purchase price on a counter, then the loan amount will fluctuate based on, and the down payment amount will fluctuate based on that percentage amount. However, when we're talking about our deposit, whatever you write in this deposit section, it's going to stay there. I say that because there is also a percentage field in this section, and that percentage field is only for calculation purposes. It's just to kind of give reference of like, oh, this deposit amount is however much for the purchase price. So that doesn't fluctuate. The only way that changes is if it's specifically countered out or in writing. So the deposit to be 3% of, you know, new purchase price, or deposit to be a flat dollar amount. When you write that part into the counter, that's how it can change. So there's a lot of different terms for this element of the contract: the initial deposit, earnest money deposit, good faith deposit. Basically, this whole section is the buyer telling the seller how much they're willing to put on the line and to keep in escrow until the rest of the funds are provided and escrow closes. So a low deposit amount, kind of deposits 101, would tell the seller that if the buyer breaches, their loss is going to be really minimal. So they might not be too serious about the purchase. If the buyer puts in a high deposit amount, or if the seller counters out like a really high deposit amount, this might cause the buyer to lose a significant amount of money in a worst case scenario. So it should be a reasonable sort of median. If the transaction cancels and there's not an agreement, a mutual agreement on releasing the deposit amount, those funds, if it's a super high amount, might be in limbo in escrow, and now the buyer can't put a deposit down on a purchase of a different property. That might be all the funds that they have. So it's something to consider. But whatever the amount ends up being, the default in the contract for delivery of this deposit is wire transfer. You can write in an alternative method like a cashier's check or a personal check, but the default is wire. This is the same concept for the conventional loans. That's the default. Don't check the box and write in wire. It's already in there as default. If the box is checked for an increased deposit to also be incorporated into the contract, the default due date for that already written in is upon removal of all contingencies. And typically you see an increased deposit come in after, like maybe the contract is subject to interior inspection. So a seller will put $1,000 initial deposit, and then once they've inspected the property, they'll put an additional $10,000 down or something like that. That would be an increased deposit, but maybe it's not necessarily once they've removed all of their contingencies. So if that's the case, there's an option to write that in. You can also write in a specific date. Maybe the buyer needs some time to get all of their funds together for the deposit, or a 401k withdrawal or something like that, where they have to wait to get the funds. California law dictates that the liquidated damages clause only applies to an increased deposit if the terms are agreed to at the time the deposit's made. So that means you need to use this DID form. This is another stupid update to the form. It's the same form. It used to be called the RID, or receipt for increased deposit. However, agents aren't receiving deposits or monies anymore, so they just changed the name to delivery of increased deposit. Same form, same concept, different name. Okay. Now, the paragraph section that is referenced in the grid, 5A, this section does a few things. So the first is that it gives escrow the power to decide on the delivery of the deposit. So if the buyer writes in a delivery method other than wire transfer, the escrow holder can still require delivery via wire transfer. So it's written into the contract. You don't have to do an addendum or any kind of like corrective measure or anything like that. If the buyer says, I'm going to make my deposit with a cashier's check, and escrow says in writing, we only accept wire transfer, then deposit delivery method is now wire transfer. That's it. So escrow has the final say. It also requires the delivery of any increased deposit to be made in the same method as that initial deposit. So if you delivered your initial deposit in as a wire, you have to do the same. You can't bring a cashier's check for your increased deposit. Also, if the liquidated damages clause on the original offer was signed and it's incorporated into the contract, initialed by all parties, then this section clarifies that you do need that DID form to add the increased deposit amount to that calculation. So what is that calculation? So this is section 3, the retention of the deposit. Paragraph 9 or paragraph 29 in the contract is that liquidated damages clause, and that outlines sort of the remedies for damages awarded to the seller. And typically those are calculated to be no more than 3% of the purchase price. So because paragraph 29 specifically addresses remedies for a contract breach and return of deposit and deposit amount, this paragraph 5A3, retention of deposit, warns that any clause added to include a release or a forfeiture of the deposit or making a deposit non-refundable should be run by your local real estate attorney first, because most of the time that clause is considered automatically invalid. And I see this so much in contracts. It blows my mind. Agents write in all the time. After inspection contingency, the deposit is released to the seller and is non-refundable. Okay, well, you can write that, but this section in the contract automatically voids that, and it has no holding. So as a buyer's agent, know that. As a listing agent, stop writing that, because in order for that clause that you guys write in to be valid, it has to satisfy the statutory liquidated damages requirements in the civil code. and I know a lot, but I don't have the first clue about that civil code. So reference a real estate attorney. Again, if you have one of those sellers that is like, I want to see it written this way, I need to have this in the contract. Just a heads up for that. Okay, so that was the deposit section. Anybody have any questions about that? This is a dense information. Okay,
Right.
we're almost done. We're almost done. So as far as credits go, this is a new section that's been added because it's become really common for it to get written into the contract. So CAR just incorporated it, made it its own section now. Just like the deposit amount, this percentage portion is just for reference, and the dollar amount doesn't fluctuate along with the purchase price. So the other thing to note is that the default is that this credit will be applied to closing costs. Doesn't say recurring or non-recurring, just closing costs in general. This section alone will satisfy any lender reference requirements, and it just automatically gets applied to those closing costs. What's important to note is the referenced paragraph in column 2 here on the grid, 5E, and this outlines lender limits on credits. And so it's important to note, if the proposed credit or this requested credit for the seller to give the buyer is more than what the lender allows, then the credit is automatically reduced to be that lender limit amount. You don't have to do an addendum to revise it or adjust it. It's automatically reduced to whatever that limit is. And these lender limits are for all credits. So not just this seller credit that's written in here. Any credits for repairs, any credits that the agent gives back in their commission to the buyer, those all count towards that limit. And 5E also clarifies that you can't just reduce the purchase price to make up the difference either. So you have to disclose any credits to the lender. That's a requirement, and it has to be done within the limits that the lender sets. So it just gives a heads up to the buyer. They might get really excited about, let's ask for all this money in a credit, and they might not get all of it. And this is why.
Got it. And then Joyce asks, would this apply to the agent giving their commission to closing costs of buyer, or where would that be submitted?
Yes. So, well, if an agent is crediting their buyer, it wouldn't go on the contract. So the contract is between seller and buyer, and an agent credit to the buyer is between the agent and the buyer. So that you would just instruct escrow to maybe write up an amendment, or you would put that on the BRE or the buyer representation agreement of what that sort of credit would be to the buyer.
Another way to do that, Lauren, is if you want to reduce your commission to a certain number, and the difference can now become a seller credit to the buyer. So let's say there's $25,000 in commission, and you're going to reduce, now your buyer's agent's commission is now $15,000. Seller can now credit the buyer $10,000 for, let's say, non-recurring closing costs, or for close. You know what I mean? So that's another way to do it, which is pretty clean, to be honest, because lenders are used to seeing that, and it makes it easier than trying to do it, I think, the other way.
Yes, definitely. And in order to do that, you would need to do, you could have write in here for, seller credit, and then you're going to want to use the CBC form, which is the cooperating broker compensation. And this is where, as the buyer's agent, you would modify this sort of commission change or reduction to modify the commission that's being received. So it sort of would be a two-part, where you would reduce the commission, and then the seller would credit that amount. So that is possible. Okay, and then the final thing that I just want to touch on are these sort of hidden costs. Not every cost in the contract is laid out in the grid. There are some elements that can become a factor later on that you want to be aware of as you're going through the purchase agreement with your client, whether it's seller or buyer. So there's obvious additional fees like HOA documents or escrow title fees. I'm talking about the things you might not necessarily see coming, or that may not apply every time. So the first one, if the seller doesn't install their smoke detector, carbon monoxide detector, or brace the water heaters properly within that time frame that's required, then because of that, let's say the appraiser goes out and they're like, well, these things weren't done, we're going to have to come back out and do, another appraisal reinspection. That's going to cost you, the buyer, X amount of dollars. This section in the contract automatically says the seller's paying for that cost. So it's important to know, for listing agents, you tell your sellers the default in the contract is they have 7 days. Get these things done, make sure it's complete. Otherwise, you might have to have these additional costs if the buyer incurs because you didn't do this up ahead of time. The other thing, just because the seller pays for the government retrofit inspections doesn't mean that they're going to pay for the items called out in that inspection to bring it up to code or to pass compliance. So that's section 10A and 10B. Buyer agents, make sure you specify who is paying these costs. It's broken up into 2 sections in this contract, who pays for the report and who pays for the repair work. Listing agents, pay attention to what these buyer agents are asking of your seller. If you know your seller, if you know they're strapped for cash, you can maybe counter out, okay, look, we'll pay to have this report done, but the buyer's gonna have to pay for it to be brought up to code, or pay for these retrofit repairs or whatever. This is all negotiable. So make sure that you know what's being written into the contract. The other thing, 10C, the contract includes a field for the home warranty costs, not to exceed a certain amount. So if the plan selected by the buyer or whatever ends up getting ordered, or that sort of coverage that's written in there, if that exceeds, or the cost of that is higher than the amount written in as not to exceed, then this section of the contract automatically says the buyer is going to pay for that overage. So make sure that the buyers know, hey, you might be responsible if you want to add on a bunch of stuff and a bunch of coverage, or if the listing agent counters back, look, the seller's only going to pay $500 towards a home warranty. Okay, well, the basic plan minimum is like $550 or something. The buyer should know, okay, now you're going to be responsible for those $50. In 11D, this is the addendum section of the FHDS form. So this FHDS, the fire hardening defensible space addendum disclosure, advisory, disclosure, and addendum. It's all 3 in one. It's the dumbest form. It's required anytime the seller is required to provide a TDS. They are also required to provide this form, whether it's in a fire zone or not. And the form is in 3 parts. One, obviously, is this disclosure. Or the first part is the advisory, saying like, this is what fire hardening is, this is what defensible space is. That's the advisory part. Then there's the disclosure part where the seller fills out. The default is that the property is in a very high fire area. So if it's not, the seller needs to check a box. If it's true that it is, then the seller then needs to go through and disclose to the buyer additional features that might cause issues with home hardening or defensible space. And then the third part is this addendum element. And that part determines who then is responsible for complying with any local or state ordinance and the costs associated with that compliance. So you have 4 options in this addendum section. One is the default, which there's no local ordinance. And if there are any state requirements, the buyer is responsible within 1 year of closing to take care of those. The other option is there is no local ordinance, and within the last 6 months, the sellers already complied with any additional state requirements, and they have verification of that. The third option is that there is an ordinance that's in effect. There's a local requirement, but it doesn't have to get done in order to close escrow. So like for me, where I live in LA, we have a local ordinance for clearing the hillsides. If it's not required to close escrow on the property, but it is something that has a cost associated with it, and needs to get have compliance signed off on. And so when we bought this property, we were not aware of all of those elements. So this would have been helpful to know that that is an additional annual expense that if you don't do it, the fire department will come by and fine you. And then the fourth element is that there is an ordinance in effect, and you can't close unless it gets signed off and it's in compliance. And that is a factor in some fire zone areas, I believe in San Diego County, that I know of off the top of my head. And the section in the contract requires the seller to either, if they already have this done, they have to give evidence to the buyer within 7 days of acceptance. If they haven't gotten it done and they need to do it before escrow closes, they have 3 days before closing to get it done and provide it to the buyer. So again, these are all kind of little things that might be additional costs. And then the last two is the SWPI form. That is the septic, well, property monument, propane, kitchen sink, everything else addendum. This form, I mentioned it last time, is really flexible. There are 13 fields that call out an allocation of some sort of cost. So as the agent, you should know what applies to that specific area, whether it's the buyer, you're the buyer's agent or the listing agent. You should know what's required for any of those specific elements. If a cert is required, is there a cost to that? Who pays for that? If in order to get the cert and get it signed off, repairs need to be done, who's going to pay for those repairs? Then the parties all need to agree on who pays for all of those specific costs. If they can't agree to those allocation of costs, then you can cancel the contract. You don't have an agreement. So keep that in mind. And then the last is kind of what we touched on a little bit before about the termite inspection. There is still no section in the contract that's been removed. It will stay removed for wooden pest, the seller to give an option for the seller to pay for termite repairs. CAR believes it's bad advice to accept responsibility for payment on repairs when you don't know what the amount will be. So any requests for termite clearance to be paid or who's going to pay it and negotiations for that should be written in on a request for repairs form and not written into the contract. Because again, the seller should see the report and know what that's going to cost. I know up north, it's really common to get this done already, so that might not be a big deal. But Southern California, for whatever reason, everybody likes to like withhold the information as much as possible, like it's going to change anything. And then they'll use that as sort of negotiation tactics. So but keep that in mind. I can't tell you how many times people get a termite report in that there's like a pergola or what's it called? The wooden, like even a balcony or something like that. It's just thousands of dollars for repair and everybody loses their mind. So it's something to consider and to factor in. So that's all that I have today on all of the financial stuff. I appreciate you guys all hanging in there. We have some other additional webinars in the works that are going to go over in more details, the due dates, the timeframes, also any of those addendums and advisories. There's new ones that are coming out. They do different things. And then we'll touch base on how to cancel in this new contract. What's that process look like? What does it look like if there's tenants on the property? There's a whole new form and a new process if there's tenants, whether they're staying or not. And then some of that other sort of fine print in the contract. So stay tuned. And
that's some juicy stuff coming up.
Yep.
Awesome job, Lauren. As always, we really appreciate what you bring to the table. Kevin, do we have Lauren's information up for everyone to access, or can we get that out to them?
Yes, we have it on the screen. We have it in the chat. I keep bombarding them with it. with a
Yeah. Well,
so-
it's important because we do have new agents that come on, or we've just joined Alta Realty Group, and so I just want to make sure that everyone has the opportunity to utilize Lauren for her services. She does our compliance internally. She also is certified, as she mentioned in the beginning of the webinar, certified CAR forms trainer and certified form advisor. So and licensed, and also runs her TC company. So she is a very busy woman, but she does an amazing job with compliance and transaction coordinating for our company. And we're so happy to have her.
Thanks so much, guys. It's always a pleasure, and look forward to coming back.
Sounds awesome, Lauren. Thank you so much. And we're getting tons and tons of thank yous from everybody. So the feeling is mutual. Right.
Thanks, everybody.
All right, perfect. Well, get out there, make it a great week and a productive week. And we will see you guys next Wednesday on the webinar. Bye-bye.